Right, let's plunge into some seriously deep philosophical waters today, folks. We're going to be tackling the Modists,
Ah, the
a
Modistae.
group of medieval thinkers who were kind of obsessed with this idea of modi significandi,
Yes,
which if you translate it literally means modes of signifying.
that's right. And I think, before we get too far into this, we can acknowledge our listener is someone who is already familiar with philosophy. So
We can skip the
we can skip the 101 and dive right into the
right into the nuances, yeah.
the good stuff.
You're diving into the work of Thomas of Erfurt, a key figure in this movement. And now here's the kicker.
Okay.
For centuries, scholars mistakenly attributed his work to John Duns Scotus.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a case of mistaken identity.
It really makes you wonder how differently these ideas would have been received if everyone knew they were coming from Thomas of Erfurt all along.
It's real mind-boggling.
Yeah.
We'll get into the impact of that misattribution later, but first,
Yeah.
who was this mysterious Thomas of Erfurt?
Well, that's part of the intrigue because we know very little about his life.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy tells us he was active in the early 14th century,
Okay.
likely taught in Paris, and was influenced by thinkers like Rodolphus Brito and Siger of Courtrai.
So he was definitely plugged into the intellectual circles of his day.
Absolutely. But his biography is still pretty much a blank slate.
Hmm.
Luckily, his work speaks volumes,
Okay.
specifically his magnum opus, De Modis Significandi.
And this is where things get really interesting for a philosopher.
Yeah.
This text became like the textbook on modism in the 14th century.
It even ended up in early printed editions of Duns Scotus's collected works, further cementing the misattribution.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Which is why figures like Charles S. Peirce and even Martin Heidegger engaged with Thomas of Erfurt's ideas, thinking they were pure Scotus.
Right.
But for now, let's just get to the heart of it. What exactly is modism?
So the Modists believed that words have inherent ways they can be used in sentences. They called these inherent ways modi significandi.
Okay, so it's not just about the meaning of a word in isolation.
Yeah.
It's about its potential for combining with other words, almost like a grammatical code embedded in the language itself.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were trying to elevate grammar to the level of a science, not just a set of rules, and here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They thought the science of grammar was actually rooted in metaphysics.
Hold on. Are they saying that by studying grammar, we can actually understand the fundamental nature of reality?
Yes.
That seems like a stretch.
Not to them.
Okay.
So the Modists believed there was a triadic relationship between word concept and thing.
Okay.
They argued that the modi significandi of a word were ultimately determined by the modi essendi, the modes of being of the thing itself.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this.
Yeah.
Are you saying they believed there was a direct link between how a word functions grammatically and its connection to the essence of the thing it represents?
Precisely. This triadic relationship is key to their thinking. Every word we utter for the Modists is not only connected to our internal understanding, but also tethered to something concrete in the external world.
So how did Thomas of Erfurt contribute to this? What made his De Modis Significandi so groundbreaking?
So Thomas of Erfurt went beyond simply describing grammatical rules like earlier grammarians. He was trying to explain the causes of different parts of speech.
Okay.
He argued that modi essendi, the modes of being, cause modi intelligendi, the modes of understanding, which in turn cause the modi significandi.
So it's like a chain reaction from the way things actually are in the world
Yes.
to how we think about them to how we express them in language.
Exactly. It's a complex system, and to illustrate it, he uses the example of the word goddess. He points out that this word signifies femininity, even though a goddess, mythologically speaking, might not inherently possess passive qualities.
So the word itself, goddess, carries a certain mode of signifying that might not perfectly align with the actual nature of the being it represents.
Right, and this gets to one of the core issues the Modists grappled with. How do you explain words that refer to things that don't actually exist?
Like those mythical creatures we all love to ponder.
For example, how can a chimera have modi essendi if it's a mythical creature?
Yeah.
How can a word signify something that doesn't have a real-world counterpart?
That does seem like a major snag in their system.
And they knew it.
Okay.
Thomas of Erfurt offered some pretty intriguing solutions in De Modis Significandi. He argued that the modi significandi of a chimera are actually derived from the parts we imagine it to be composed of a lion's head, a goat's body, a serpent's tail.
So we're taking bits and pieces of real things
Yeah.
and combining them in our minds to form a concept of something that doesn't actually exist.
Yes, and the same goes for privations like blindness.
Yeah.
They signify our understanding of the absence of something. So blindness doesn't represent a thing in itself, but rather the lack of sight, which still has a mode of being in our minds.
That's an interesting workaround. But doesn't that create a kind of hierarchy where things that actually exist have a stronger connection to reality than things that only exist in our minds?
That's a great question, and one that highlights the complexities the Modists were trying to untangle it. It also leads into another crucial point, the distinction between signifying and referring, which was central to their project.
I'm all ears. Walk me through that.
So they were more concerned with how words signify, meaning that whole process of word concept and thing, rather than how they simply refer to specific objects in the world.
So while a logician might be laser focused on the truth or falsehood of a statement like the chimera is a green, the modists were more interested in how the word chimera comes to signify the concept of a chimera in the first place.
Exactly. And that focus on signification led them to some extremely intricate explanations, which some scholars believe may have contributed to modism's eventual decline.
So they get a bit too caught up in their own complex system,
Perhaps.
lost sight of the forest for the trees, so to speak.
Perhaps, but regardless, modism offers us a truly fascinating look at how these medieval thinkers were trying to understand the deep connections between language thought and the very fabric of reality.
Yeah, it really is fascinating.
It is.
It's amazing how they were wrestling with these profound questions centuries ago.
Yeah.
But didn't they also draw inspiration from the philosophical giants who came before them?
They did, in fact. To really grasp the modists, you have to understand the intellectual climate they were working in. The influx of Aristotle's writings on metaphysics and natural philosophy had a huge impact on medieval thought.
Right, Aristotle was all the rage back then.
Yeah.
So how did his ideas shape the modist project?
Well, the modists were grappling with whether grammar could be considered a science in the Aristotelian sense. They wanted to elevate it beyond mere rules and show that it could be demonstrative, meaning that it could lead to true and certain knowledge about the world.
So they were aiming high. What convinced them that grammar could be on par with something like physics in terms of producing knowledge?
They argued that the principles of grammar, those modi significandi, were ultimately grounded in the modi essendi. It was this connection to metaphysics that, in their view, gave grammar a solid scientific foundation.
It's almost as if they were saying that the structure of language mirrors the structure of reality itself.
Exactly. And the way they structured their theories also reflects this Aristotelian influence. They saw a parallel between the ordering of modes and the ordering of disciplines in an Aristotelian system.
That sounds pretty abstract. Can you give me a concrete example of what you mean?
Okay, so think about how Aristotle organizes the sciences. Physics, the study of moving things, is subordinate to metaphysics, the study of being as such.
Right, because anything that moves also exists, but not everything that exists moves, so metaphysics is more fundamental.
Precisely. The modists applied a similar logic to their modes. They argued that the modi significandi are derived from the modi intelligendi, which in turn are caused by the modi essendi.
So it's like a hierarchy of knowledge. The way we signify, the way we understand, all stemming ultimately from the fundamental way things exist in the world.
Yes, it's a very elegant system, even if it did run into some difficulties, as we talked about, accounting for things like chimera or blindness, posed a real challenge to their framework.
Challenges aside, it's fascinating how ambitious they were in trying to weave together language, thought, and reality into a coherent system.
It's a testament to their intellectual rigor and honestly makes their work all the more interesting for philosophers today. But let's shift gears for a moment. Remember that whole mistaken identity situation with Duns Scotus?
Oh, right. How could we forget?
Yeah.
It's not every day that a philosopher's work gets attributed to someone else for centuries.
Right.
What impact did this mix-up have on the reception of Thomas of Erfurt's ideas?
Well, for one, it meant that those ideas reached a much wider audience than they might have otherwise. Major figures like Charles S. Peirce and Martin Heidegger engaged with the modus significandi thinking it was Scotus.
So Thomas of Erfurt was shaping philosophical debates without anyone even knowing it was him. It's incredible.
It is, and it speaks to the power of his ideas. In fact, though Scotus himself was influenced by modism, it's unlikely that he was directly influenced by Thomas of Erfurt.
Wait, why not? They were both big names in medieval philosophy.
Because de modis significandi didn't really gain widespread circulation until after Scotus's death, the influence actually flowed in the opposite direction from Thomas of Erfurt to later thinkers who mistakenly attributed his work to Scotus.
Talk about a posthumous philosophical legacy. But while we're on the subject of influence, you mentioned Meister Eckhart earlier. Didn't he have some connection to Thomas of Erfurt?
So they were both in Erfurt around the same time, living just a few streets apart.
So it seems impossible that they wouldn't have known each other. Were they rivals, friends?
We simply don't have any direct evidence of their interactions, but it's fascinating to think about these two philosophical giants living in such close proximity.
Imagine the conversations they might have had. But even without direct evidence, are there any hints that Eckhart's work might have been influenced by Thomas of Erfurt's ideas?
Some scholars believe that Eckhart's grammatical approach to interpreting scripture might have been inspired by Thomas's work.
So it's possible that Thomas of Erfurt's influence extended even into the realm of theology.
Absolutely. Now let's go back to those big names we keep mentioning, Peirce and Heidegger. They both encountered De Modis Significandi, thinking it was a work by Scotus. How did this shape their own philosophical projects?
Okay, let's start with Charles S. Peirce, the American pragmatist. How did he connect with these modist ideas?
Peirce was a huge admirer of Scotus, and he was clearly intrigued by the theory of signs presented in De Modis Significandi. He even quoted it extensively in his lectures.
So he was drawn to how the modists explored the nature of signification, how signs come to represent objects and concepts.
Exactly. And you can see some interesting parallels between the Modis project and Peirce's own semiotic theory. They both delve into the relationship between signs, objects, and meaning.
Even if he didn't fully grasp the ins and outs of modism, it seems like Peirce was resonating with something fundamental in those ideas. What about Heidegger? How did De Modis Significandi influence his work?
Well, remember, Heidegger's habilitation schrift, his major work qualifying him for a professorship, was actually based on the theory of meaning presented in De Modis Significandi.
And he was a phenomenologist, right? How did he connect these ideas about signification to his own focus on lived experience and the structures of consciousness?
Heidegger was particularly interested in how De Modis Significandi connected language to our understanding of being. He saw this reflected in his own concept of being in the world, suggesting that the structure of language shapes our very experience of reality.
So Heidegger was suggesting that the categories of language we use influence how we perceive and interact with the world around us.
Precisely. And this idea, though, explored through the lens of what he thought was a work by Scotus, can be traced back to Thomas of Erfurt and the modist tradition.
It's amazing how these medieval ideas about language had such a ripple effect across philosophical history.
It is, but the connections don't stop there. We even find Thomas of Erfurt mentioned by Jacques Derrida, the French post-structuralist.
Wait, Derrida, that's surprising. He isn't exactly known for being a fan of medieval philosophy.
True, but in of grammatology, he specifically mentions Thomas of Erfurt in relation to the idea that logic is ultimately a branch of semiotics.
So the rules of logic are grounded in the way signs function and create meaning. It sounds like a very modest concept.
It is, and this connection highlights how these seemingly obscure medieval theories about language can have a surprisingly long reach.
It's incredible to think about how Thomas of Erfurt's ideas continue to spark interest even in contemporary philosophical circles.
It's a testament to their depth and relevance. And speaking of relevance, I think it's worth stepping back for a moment and considering what modism as a school of thought has to offer us today.
Okay, let's bring this back to the present.
Well,
What can these medieval thinkers teach us in the 21st century? I think one of the biggest takeaways from modism is, like the importance of taking language seriously.
Yep.
It's not just a tool for communication. It's a fundamental aspect of how we understand and interact with the world.
Yeah, the modists remind us that language isn't neutral. The
Yeah.
words we use, the grammar we employ, they all shape our perception of reality.
It's almost as if they're saying that the structure of language can influence the structure of our thoughts.
Exactly, and that has implications for everything from how we approach philosophical problems to how we understand social and political issues. The modists challenge us to be more aware of the assumptions that are kind of baked into the language that we use every day.
They're asking us to pay attention to the subtle ways language shapes our understanding of ourselves and the world around us that seems especially relevant in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information and rhetoric.
Absolutely. And the modists, with their incredibly detailed analysis of language, offer us a framework for thinking critically about the words and concepts we encounter. They help us unpack the underlying assumptions and potential biases that might be hidden in plain sight.
Their work is a reminder that language is never simply a transparent window onto reality. It's always shaping and filtering our perceptions in subtle ways.
Now, remember how the modists saw that deep connection between the way things are in the world, how we think about them, and how we express them in language?
That triadic relationship between word, concept, and thing.
Right. Well, this raises a really interesting question for us today. Does grammar shape how we understand reality, or is it the other way around?
That's a tough one. Do the categories of language determine how we see the world? Or do those categories arise from a deeper pre-linguistic understanding of reality? It's like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Exactly. And it's a question that philosophers are still grappling with today. The work of cognitive linguists, for example, suggests that the way we use metaphors and spatial language can actually influence our understanding of abstract concepts.
So the way we talk about things can actually shape how we think about them.
It's a fascinating area of research, and it shows how these questions raised by the Madas are still relevant centuries later. We're still trying to unravel the complex relationship between language, thought, and reality.
And that's the beauty of philosophy. It's an ongoing conversation, and even these thinkers from the 14th century can still offer us new insights and perspectives on these fundamental questions.
They remind us that even in the midst of these intricate philosophical debates, there's a deep human desire to understand our place in the cosmos. And for the Mahdists, language was the key to unlocking those mysteries.
Well said. It seems like we've given our listener plenty to ponder today. This whole idea of modi significandi, the challenges the Mahdists faced, and their surprising influence on later thinkers like Piers Heidegger and even Derrida.
Yeah, it's a testament to the enduring power of their ideas.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, let's leave our listener with a final thought to mull over. We've talked about how language can shape our understanding of reality. But what about the reverse? Can our experience of reality change the way language itself functions?
That's a fantastic question, and one that I think perfectly captures the spirit of this deep dive. It challenges us to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deeper into the mysteries of language and thought.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those mysteries. Thanks for joining us on this philosophical adventure.